Okay, we are on live at Gray Ghost Vineyards. Welcome to Season 3, Sneak Peeks, Episode 2. Happy half hour. I'm looking to see if we've got anybody checking in. Ooh, Al and Cheryl, I think it could end up being a very quiet night. Wait a second. We've got 1,000 people logging in. This is good stuff. And we shot up to 4,000, 6,000. Oh my goodness, this is incredible. Hopefully we'll start hearing a little bit of applause. 7,000 people. I'd love to see somebody write in that they can hear us. Because I always, for some reason, the tech department never remembers to turn on the mic. Hi, Diane. Got Diane Andrews checking in. Good stuff. I'm really just a little bit more applause. And 7,000 people, 8,000. Wilson and Karen are here. And we hear you fine. Thank you, Karen. We can always count on you. And now that we're up to 8,000 people, let me turn it over to your hosts, Al and Cheryl Kellert.
Are we on? Are we on now?
Yes, we're on.
Thanks again for joining us for this version of another happy half hour at Gray Ghost. This is really kind of exciting to be with you since it's been 2 months since we've been with you in this particular program. We're broadcasting tonight live from the Gray Ghost Studio, WC 1999. And I can't thank you enough for joining us. I thought it'd be nice to just start right off on the lighter side. And a real quick story about construction. There was a major building being built in Washington. Well, actually it was in Crystal City. It was a high-rise. There were 3 guys that were up on the top, actually part of the construction crew, and they were sitting on a big beam. One was an Irish guy, another one was Mexican, and then of course we had our Virginia redneck. They were sitting there having lunch when the Irishman opened up his lunch bucket, and there, to his astonishment, was a corned beef and cabbage lunch. And he said to the other 2 guys, "I can't stand this. I have this every lunch. I tell you, if I have it again, I'm going to throw myself off this building and commit suicide." About that time, the Mexican opened up his lunch, and there was a burrito. And he said, I'm with you. I can't stand burritos. I get them every time. If I get another burrito, I'm going to throw myself off and kill myself. Finally, the redneck opened up his and looked inside, and there was a bologna sandwich. And he said, "Guys, I'm with you. Bologna sandwiches every week. This is it. If I get another bologna sandwich, I'm going to kill myself." The very next day, they were sitting up there ready for lunch when the Irishman opened up his lunch bucket, and there was a corned beef and cabbage lunch. He screamed and jumped off to his death. Immediately after that, the Mexican opened up his lunch, and there was a burrito. He, too, just couldn't stand it and jumped off and killed himself. Finally, the redneck opened up his, and lo and behold, there was a bologna sandwich. And he said, "I'm with you guys, I've had it." And he, too, jumped off. Well, since it was 3 joining deaths, they ended up having the funeral together. And the wife of the Irishman was talking to the other 2 women and said, "If I only knew he was not into corned beef and cabbage, I would have never made that lunch for him." And the Mexican wife then looked at her and said, "Well, I'm the same way. I didn't know my sweetheart didn't like burritos, otherwise I would have never made that." They then looked over at the redneck's wife and said, "What about you?" She said, "Don't look at me, he made his own lunch." But well, once again, if you remember in March, I said we may be coming to light at the end of the tunnel. And I think as of this morning, we've actually arrived. We were kind of excited when we found out that face masks are no longer going to be required. So this really is something that we're really looking forward to. Now, even though face masks have disappeared, you'll notice that Cheryl has refused to give up her 2-glass program. One of the things I really admire about Cheryl is her dedication to quality and her dedication to health and safety. So once again, her 2 glasses are here to protect her and all of those around us. And while I've got this opportunity, I should ask Cheryl if she'll just give us a real brief take on her view but we first have to wait until we talk about the wine. So you'll have to hold off on that. Speaking of wine, what we're going to do is feature the 2020 Gray Ghost Gewurztraminer. And let me talk a little bit about it before I pour a toast for us. This is known for its spicy quality. We produce it in what's called an Alsatian style, which means it's not quite as sweet as a German style Gewurztraminer, really designed to go very nicely with food. In fact, the residual sugar on this is less than 1%. The wine is cold fermented in stainless steel and is served with spicier dishes. We really enjoy it at Thanksgiving. It's a great Thanksgiving wine. And so what I'm going to do now is pour our samples so that we can toast you and toast what's transpiring as far as the wine masks are concerned. Now, oh, how foolish of me. Almost made a major faux pas. Now it's time to toast normalcy. So here's to normalcy. Wow, now that's a great, great wine. Now that we have the wine in our glass, let's go back to Cheryl. And Cheryl, if you would very briefly, well, I'll tell you what, take as much time as you need and talk a little bit about the last 2 months and what's transpired at the winery and how exciting things have been. Would you elaborate on that a little bit? I think you can see that that said it all. Once again, Cheryl, I thank you for your comments, your insight, and I hope all of those that are out there appreciate the amount of effort that Cheryl puts into this and how thankful we are for all your work. Now, let me give you a real quick update on the vineyard. If you remember in March, we talked a little bit about a change in our pruning process, and we showed you how we were pruning the Chardonnay. Instead of leaving the standard spurs with the 2 primary buds that would ultimately generate the fruit, we opted to go with a pruning system that left the spurs with as many as 8 to 10 buds. And if you remember, I said one of the things it was going to do is increase the labor, but also give us the ability to slow down the growth of these vines. So during the course of the spring, we went out 3 times to re-prune, each time opening what's called the wound. So it was allowing the vines to bleed the water and not push the primary buds. As a result, basically the vine stayed dormant. Then we had a frost. And the frost, from what we've been told, destroyed a number of the Chardonnay vines throughout Virginia once again. Our buds had not broke. The Chardonnay right now is well behind everything else in the vineyard. And it looks to me, based on a little review on Friday, that we're going to be producing Chardonnay approaching 100% crop. So I'm excited to tell you everything that's coming up looks like it's carrying fruit. Now I hope you all understand this is a long growing season. So anything can happen between now and harvest. But at this particular point, we have at least solved one problem that we had last year, and it didn't repeat itself this year. So we're really excited about that. Now, what I want to do is focus on what we're focusing on tonight, and that is how to create a wine cellar or a wine library. What we're doing tonight is we're actually sitting in our library, which was established in 1999 when this particular building was built. Why the library? One of the things we wanted to do was maintain a record of all of the reds that had been produced since we opened in 1994 with our 1993 vintage. Also included, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, was a number of our adus, which were first produced in 1999. It also gives us the ability to monitor the wine development over time. Since the reds we're producing have the ability to age, it's kind of interesting to watch how they age and how they develop over time. It also provides an interesting opportunity to share with customers and our friends the opportunities to experience special tastings of old reds. We also have hosted over a period of time vertical tastings. Now, vertical tastings, and many of you have already participated in these, are nothing more than taking the same wine from our vineyard, but from different vintages, and giving people an opportunity to actually experience these wines and what's happened during the aging process. The only primary difference in these wines is what transpired during that vintage or growing season, and also the length of time they've been down here in the library. Finally, it gives us a tremendous opportunity to provide old wines for sale. And this is something we now retain up at the tasting room, is actually a catalog of the wines that are in the library, and give people who are interested in purchasing them an opportunity by looking through those catalogs. One of the other things we do down here is display our medals that have been won by the wines. When you come down to the library, you'll see on the shelves and also in the opening foyer wines that carry medals. Anytime a wine is sold out, the last wine comes down with its medals. Now, some of you are going to be out there saying, but Al, I thought with corks they should be laying down. I have to admit there's some pretty nice wines down here, so I'm going to kind of confess that Cheryl and I enjoyed the wines, and the bottles are now containing water. So I just want you to know, no wine is going to be wasted. Now, let's talk a little bit about how this all got started. When we first started the winery back in 83, well, I should say when we bought the vineyard, or started the vineyard in 86, and then we're growing the grapes. When we got ready to open the winery, cash flow became definitely an issue. Anyone who's ever been involved in starting a new business understands what I'm talking about. Along comes Amy, and she encourages us to set aside wines that we can hold for posterity's sake. Well, Cheryl and I were fit to be tied. How can you pull wines off the market and struggle with cash flow? But we went ahead and took Amy's advice. Amy, this is to you. Wow, that's a good wine. Okay, so because of Amy, what you see behind me exists. Now, how was it designed? It was actually created as part of the warehouse. When this building was built in 1999, this segment of the building was actually set up to hold a library. It was designed to duplicate a cave, so the environment down here is perfect for aging wines. It took into account 3 issues that affect any type of a cellar and cellaring wines. First, temperature. The temperature down here is constant. It varies no more than 4 degrees during the course of the entire year. And that's critical when you're aging wine. You do not want wines to fluctuate temperatures rapidly, or the wines will ultimately be destroyed. Secondly, we built it on a firm foundation. So we minimized any vibrations or movements that could occur, which ultimately will cause wine to be damaged. And finally, we eliminated light. One of the damaging properties of UV is it will affect the length of time a wine will age. So there is no UV light, no natural light down here. Everything is maintained totally in darkness. Finally, what's the capacity? This library is capable of holding up to 5,600 bottles, which represents about a 30-year length of time for vintages. Now, what's in the library? We hold all of our reds and the Adu, some of the Adu, dating back to 1993. The critical thing that we do is maintain some wine from every vintage and from each different variety. So there's a total of 101 different wines based on variety and vintage, and that includes the Adu. Why the Adu? When we first made it in 1999, again, I have to thank Amy. She recognized that the Vidal had taken on botrytis, or the noble rot. So that segment of the vineyard was blocked off, and we produced the Adu for the first time as a Sauterne. As many of you know, Sauternes do age. So we put some of the 1999 in the library and gave us the opportunity of actually aging it. Do I have questions?
No, I was just vintage correcting. 97 was our first.
Thank you, 97. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay. Now, let's stay on the subject of a library, but let's transfer now into a wine cellar. And let's talk about how you can end up starting your own wine cellar if you don't already. A gentleman years ago told me that the way he started his was quite simple and very cost effective. When he found a wine that he really liked and one that could be cellared, he'd buy a case, enjoy 6 of those bottles immediately, and put 6 away in his cellar. Once the first 6 were gone, he would repeat the process of buying another case, ultimately creating his wine cellar. Now, this is a very slow process, but it's a painless process and does give you the opportunity of actually collecting some very nice old red wines. What do you age, and how do you pick wine to go into the cellar? It's important to note that we're a society of immediate consumption, immediate gratification. So most of the wines made today are designed to be drunk when you purchase them. And I like to call those my grocery store wines. When you go into the grocery store in their wine department, for the most part, most people are buying wine to be consumed that evening with their dinner. So these wines, for the most part, are not made to be aged. Another wine that's not made to be aged are those that contain the screw-on caps. Anytime you see a wine that has a screw-on cap, you're looking at a wine that should be consumed young, that should be consumed upon purchase. It's not saying there's poor quality. All it's saying is that wine is not designed to be laid down. Artificial stoppers and artificial corks fall into this category as well. They have a very short life expectancy. Based on studies, artificial corks and plastic corks actually allow air into the bottle much quicker than an actual cork, thus causing the wine to deteriorate rather quickly and have a very short lifespan. Again, that's not saying that those wines are bad or not compatible to being consumed. It's just saying that they're not designed to be laid down. Now, when you see a wine with a natural cork, normally that's an indication of a premium wine. A natural cork is very expensive. Plastic corks, plastic stoppers normally cost about 10 cents or less. Screw-on caps about 5 cents a piece. Of course, we're using a very premium cork that runs about 50 cents a piece. So when you put a premium cork into a bottle, you're normally looking at a premium bottle of wine. This allows the wine to breathe. It allows the wine to give the potential of aging. And the downside is that cork has to be kept wet. If you look behind me, you'll notice that all the wines in the library are laying on their side. That's very important for the life of that wine. Now, what type of varietals would you be able to put away? Most of the Bordeaux reds do favor or do contribute to wines that can be laid down. And these include, of course, the Cabernet Sauvignon, the Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, and Melbac. Bordeaux's coming out of France are oftentimes a blend of 2, 3, or maybe 4 of these wines. Because of the type of wine and the type of wine that you can produce from these particular grapes, they do provide the ability to lay down. Any of the reds that we have in the library are the result of these 5, one or more of these 5 grapes. A lot of people say you can't lay down a white, and for the most part that is true. However, if a white has been aged in oak, it has absorbed tannin, and tannin is one of the properties that gives a wine its ability to age. Now, in our example, our reserve Chardonnays have been aged in oak for up to 18 months. So they've absorbed a good deal of tannin and therefore can be laid down. Cheryl and I have used or actually saved some of our reserve Chardonnays that were anywhere from 5 to 10 years old, and they were still pouring as if they were just been bottled. So it does give you an indication that whites can be laid down, but it's important to know that it's very specific to how that wine was made. There are other wines that I'm not that familiar with, but do develop very well with aging, and those are some of the full-bodied Italian wines and some of the full-bodied reds coming out of the Eastern European countries. Again, I can't say that I'm familiar with individual wines of that category, but I have tasted some very, very nice Italian wines and Eastern European wines that had been aged, and they are delightful. Now, what else is critical? Well, I think the vintage that the wine comes from becomes extremely critical, especially from the area that that particular wine is being generated from. If the locale had a cool, wet year, oftentimes the reds come out to be very light and much more drinkable early on and less likely to mature or develop over time with aging. However, if it was a very warm, dry year, the berries have a tendency to be extremely small, producing some very intense deep reds that are very nice and very subject to age. Because of the small berries, there's an increased amount of tannin that's absorbed from the skin during fermentation, and then of course additional tannin absorbed from the barrels from oak aging. So in those particular instances, those reds would tend to be more in the line of aging wines than wines that came from wetter years. Again, tannin is a critical element for aging. So any wine that carries high tannins will, chances are, have a tendency to be aged, and the aging process merely softens those tannins, giving the wine a much smoother and more velvety finish. Now, another critical element associated with aging of wines is what winery did the wine come from? Do I have a question here?
Yes, our friend Karen Quaintance would like to know how many slots are left in the library.
Karen, I love you. I can tell you right now that it's probably, I haven't counted them specifically, but it's probably less than 500. But that's a good question. I've never really thought of checking that out myself.
We need to open some slots.
I can
right,
see
Karen?
That. Now, going back to the producer of the wine, I think it's really critical to know the winery that you're going to purchase wine from for the aging and basically cellaring of the wine. Not all wineries are producing reds that can be aged. So understand that you have to know the philosophy of that particular winery, and more importantly, the philosophy of the winemaker at that winery. Now that's another critical issue. One winery may be producing some great wines for laying down, and then they switch winemakers. And a winemaker has their own philosophy and may change the philosophy of the winemaking at that winery and thus produce wines that are lighter in style and more drinkable early. So it's incredibly important to know the background of the winery and what they're currently doing. And when I say background, know the history of the wine that is being produced. Have they a history of producing quality wines that did have the ability to age? Now, what's the benefit of a cellar? Well, quite frankly, the way I look at it is it gives you the ability to enjoy great wines as they get greater. A great wine, as it ages, softens and becomes just velvety. Just the finish is just delightful. And with the cellar, you have that ability to do that. It also gives you the ability to enjoy wines that you can no longer purchase on the open market or from the winery. Keep in mind, wines are a commodity that once the wine is gone, it's not like Coca-Cola where a formula is made and then can be repeated. A vintage, when it's gone, is gone forever. So if you have a cellar and you have collected old wines, you have the option of enjoying a wine long after that wine disappears from the market. Finally, and this is strictly an ego thing, it's kind of cool to show off to your friends. I kind of think it's always neat when you go and visit somebody that they take you downstairs and say, hey, why don't we pick a wine out of the cellar? And of course, you immediately, as you start to oogle about it. Now, what's the hazards of a wine cellar? And yes, there are hazards. If the wine cellar is not environmentally perfect, you do run the risk of losing your wines. You have to make sure your wine cellar is controlled, both in its environment, its temperature, and its darkness. It's also very important to know that some people, once they get a wine cellar, decide that they're going to hold their wines. They have a tendency to save them. And oftentimes wines can be kept too long, and therefore the wines go downhill. And nothing hurts more than to hear somebody who said, I had a great 1982 Bordeaux that we opened up the other night and it had turned to vinegar or it had turned brown. And when you have a great wine like that, you really hate to hear that it's gone downhill. Another thing to keep in mind is wines are not designed to be collected. They're designed to be consumed. And nothing hurts me more than when somebody comes in and says, my wine cellar now exceeds 3,000 bottles. And I say, so how many people are consuming them? They'll say, well, it's me and my wife. If I do the math, it would take close to 9 years to consume those, assuming they didn't add another bottle to it and had a bottle every night. So don't make the wine cellar a collectible area. Make it a location where you're holding wines to enjoy. Keep in mind, in my opinion, wines are a gift of God to be enjoyed, not to be saved. So that's critical. Now, how do you make your wine cellar last your whole life? Periodically, enjoy the old vintages. Pull one out, have it, you get to see how that wine is developing and whether or not the rest of the wine should be consumed relatively quickly or do they still have the ability to age. And then the other thing that we always do is don't hold the wines to the point that they are going to go over the hill. Do enjoy them. One of the other things to do is rotate your stock. It's always fun to add new wines to your library or to your cellar to replace the older vintages. Basically what you're doing is you're guaranteeing that that cellar is going to always provide you with great wines into the future, and at the same time while you're consuming the older ones. The other thing I would encourage you to do is do something different periodically. Don't lock yourself into single wines, but expand your horizon. Add something new periodically to the library, and you may be surprised. It may turn out to be something that's really, really good down the road, or it may be something that's not so good. But don't look at that as a failure. Look at that as an opportunity to increase your knowledge and understanding of wines and how they age. What that's going to do is make future decisions much easier and give you a much better opportunity to produce a library or a cellar that has truly great wines. Now, I wonder if you have limited space. In our particular instance here, we designed this with the idea of having wines that both Cheryl and I could enjoy, our family could enjoy, but we could enjoy with our friends and our customers. But that doesn't hold for everyone. If you don't have a large area, a dark closet will suffice. When Cheryl and I were living up in the Dale City area, we actually had a small library shoved away in the back of our closet, so we were able to hold older wines. Another thing to do is if you've got a basement, cordon off a small area, maybe enclose it against the wall, which is natural, against earth or earth area, and you'll find that it can maintain coolness, darkness, and hold those old wines. A lot of people are living now in apartments, and that doesn't keep you from having a wine cellar. There are a number of wine fridges or wine coolers that are out there that are thermostatically controlled. It gives you a place to store wines at an exact temperature, anywhere that you can place them anywhere in the house or the apartment. And basically what you have there is a self-contained cellar. They come in a varying sizes, and always the nice thing about it is it's unique to you. It's wines that you want to hold. In closing, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the do's and don'ts. I told Amy is waving to me.
Karen is asking, did you lose any wine in the 2011 earthquake?
Karen, I'm glad you asked that. One of the things I often used to talk about is the construction of this building. This building was actually designed to be earthquake resistant. And when we had that quake, nothing moved in the building. It's sitting on what's called a floating foundation. And the incredible thing is in the tasting room, pictures were askew, everything basically showed signs of movement. Nothing moved down here. So to answer your question, no. This building actually withstood the entire amount of vibration, which was really kind of exciting. And trust me, I was down here checking it immediately after the shaking. But very good question. Any others, Amy?
Well, only our dear friend Chris and Sally wondering if we're doing an inventory reduction sale in order to make more spaces in the library.
Very good question. Cheryl and I are taking care of that personally. So we definitely keep the inventory under control. Is that not correct?
Rotating. They're rotating.
Now, some of the do's and don'ts. What the first thing on the do is enjoy your cellar. Enjoy the wines in the cellar. What I'd tell you not to do is don't hoard the wines. Nothing is more discouraging than to know that somebody has retained a huge cellar that they could have never consumed. They pass on, it's in the will, and then I hear about the heirs who are enjoying some great wines, and as they're toasting their long-lost relative, they're enjoying these wines with popcorn and peanuts. Yes, Amy?
So Andrew's question is very timely. When drinking your wine from your cellar, how can you tell if it is at its peak?
If the wine, normally if you were to graph it, a wine forms a bell curve. And as the wine is developing, it's actually improving over time. So each time you taste it, it's going to have a little softer finish. And one of the things I should note is keep in mind, wine is a living thing. It's never going to be the same today as it was yesterday or will be tomorrow, but it's always developing in the bottle. Normally what tends to happen is when it reaches its peak, there's a slight plateau. And at that particular time, you'll begin to notice that there's no improvement, but it's not falling flat either. And normally that's a period of time when the wine has reached its peak. It's also a time when you now know the wine can only go one direction. and that's downhill. So normally if you hit that peak and you notice that wine is staying at a very comfortable level, you're probably at the optimum period to enjoy it. How long it's going to stay that way, I really can't say because that's unique to each wine. But it will ultimately begin to fade off. The other things that I would also mention is when you enjoy your wine, make sure you enjoy it with the idea that you're going to enjoy each of the bottles down the road. But the critical thing is buy the wines that have the ability to age. So what I look for is wines that have natural cork, that have a history of being aged, and also the type of wine that will be aged. Don't age a screw-on capped wine. Go ahead and enjoy those, have a good time with them. Many of them are great wines, and quite frankly, the screw-on cap makes a lousy Christmas decoration. So for that reason, right off the bat, you won't see me saving them. Another thing too is enjoy wines, but find out a little bit about them. And the best way to do this is get in touch with the winery. You can call them and get their advice as to whether or not that wine can be laid down. If you're buying that wine from a wine shop, most wine shop owners are very familiar with their wines that they're selling, especially these really nice wine shops, and they will give you more of an insight as to whether or not that wine can be laid down. And again, don't make your wine cellar something that you will never enjoy. Yeah, it's fun to go in and look at them, but those bottles are designed to be enjoyed. One of the things I want to close with is talking a little bit about decanting. And I know that's a critical issue associated with old red wines. When you're looking at this wine cellar, the older wines we do have sediment that's been laid in the base of the bottle. And that sediment really is nothing more than tannins that have bonded back together and formed sediment that's heavier than the wine, and therefore settles to the bottom. That's why when you have a cellar, you don't want to turn the bottle. You want to leave that bottle perfectly still, always resting in place so that that sediment can fall to the bottom. Now, how do we decant? One of the things we have down in the library is an 1800s decanter that was used to decant old red wines. And what I'm going to do is demonstrate that and show you how this decanter actually would function. To make it a little bit easier, I'm going to put a card behind it so you can actually see the decanter a little bit better. The decanter, as I mentioned, was designed to decant old reds in the 1800s when a owner would go down into their cellar and want to have a nice red for the guests that they'd have. So they would go down into the cellar, pick an old red wine, and set it upright for about 2 weeks. And this would allow the sediment to fall to the base of the bottle. Then they would cut the capsule, remove the cork, and very gently place it in the cradle. At that time, they would light the candle which was underneath the decanter, maybe. Well, let's do this. There we go. Now the candle is directly under the shoulder of the bottle. As they began to decant with the decanter on the end, you'll notice the incredible control you have as you're decanting the red. all of the red wine now is going into your decanter, and you're looking at the light through the shoulder of the wine, watching for the sediment to reach the shoulder of the bottle. Once it reached there, you would stop decanting, and then you would have an old red wine in your decanter to serve to your guests, and all of the sediment stayed in the bottle. So this was actually designed to decant very old reds. People have asked us why we have it down here and not up at the house. Cheryl and I have found that it takes way too long, so we have no problem chewing on the sediment to get to the wine. All right, with that,
I'll show people some of the medals down here. I'm going back to location. Those are all the awarded wines we were talking about earlier.
now in all fairness, developing a cellar is a life experience. It's something that takes a lot of time and a lot of thought. And I know there's a lot of questions out there concerning how you go about it, or if some additional questions that may not have been covered. I hope you would feel free to get in touch with us. We'll be more than happy to answer any questions that we can, and questions that we can't answer, we'll be more than happy to research them. What I do want to do is thank you all once again for joining us. And as usual, it's kind of fun to close with a spot of humor, especially now that we're rapidly coming back to normal. At one of our hardware stores not too long ago, a gentleman went in and he wasn't that familiar with what he was looking for, and he happened to come across a thermos. He'd never seen one before, so he went up to the proprietor and said, "What exactly is this?" He said, "Well, it's a thermos." He said, "Well, what does it do?" And he said, "Well, it keeps cold food cold and hot food hot." And he said, "Oh, that's incredible. Let me have one." So the next day he was going to his office or his business, and he had his thermos with him. And he walked in, and a friend of his came and said, "So what have you got there?" And he says, "I've got a thermos." And he said, "Well, what does the thermos do?" And he said, "Well, it keeps cold things cold and hot things hot." And he said, "Wow, it's incredible. So what do you have in it?" And he said, "Well, I've got some coffee and some ice cream." With that, I want to thank you all once again for joining us. We've had a wonderful time with you, and I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate giving us a call.
This has been another episode of Happy Half Hour starring Al and Cheryl Kellert, brought to you by Gray Ghost Vineyards and our executive producer.